A coffee shop. Two women. One invoice on the table. One of them slides it across like it's a napkin. Total due, 5 figures. The other one doesn't even blink, because she already knew. She always knew. This was never a question of if she'd pay. It was only ever a question of how much this time. If you are a woman who has ever been the one who just handles it, you already know exactly what that feeling is. And if you're not, buckle up, because this is the part of the money conversation nobody puts in the personal finance books. Here's the thing nobody says out loud. Women don't just pay bills. Women get handed bills. There's a difference, and it's the difference this whole video is about. Most people think financial stress comes from not having enough money. That's the easy version of the story, the one that fits neatly into a budgeting app. But there's a second, quieter tax that has nothing to do with how much a woman earns and everything to do with what happens the moment she starts earning it. The second she becomes financially capable, she becomes financially responsible for things she never agreed to be responsible for. Not legally, socially. Which, as it turns out, is worse, because you can't renegotiate a social contract nobody let you read before signing. Let's call it what it is. A hidden tax. Not the one collected by the government. The one collected by everyone around her. We're not talking about the pink tax on razors, though sure, that's annoying too. We're talking about something bigger. The invisible surcharge that gets added to a woman's bank account the moment people find out it has money in it. Most people assume the biggest financial burden a woman carries is the gender pay gap. And yes, that's real, that's documented, that's a whole different video. But here's the part that gets skipped. Even when a woman closes that gap, even when she out-earns everyone in the room, the tax doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. That's where things get interesting. Because the moment a woman becomes the one with money, she doesn't get treated like a person who succeeded. She gets treated like a resource, a safety net, a walking emergency fund with a heartbeat. Picture the dynamic. A woman does well. She gets a good job, a raise, a business finally turns a profit. And almost immediately, something shifts around her, quietly, the way a room temperature drops before anyone says why. Suddenly, she's the one who can afford it. She's the one who doesn't mind. She's the one who would probably just want to help anyway, right? Nobody asked her. They just decided. And the exhausting part isn't paying. Plenty of women would pay happily if they were asked instead of assumed upon. The exhausting part is never being asked. This is the tax. Not a percentage. An expectation. Let's slow down here, because this is where most people get the psychology completely backwards. They assume the burden is financial. It's not, or at least it's not only financial. It's identity-based. A man who earns well is often seen as accomplished. A woman who earns well is often seen as available. Available to lend, available to cover, available to smooth over whatever financial gap someone else created. Same bank balance. Completely different social role attached to it. And here's the twist nobody warns you about before you get good at money. The better a woman gets with money, the more invisible her own needs become to the people around her, because everyone assumes she's fine. She has to be fine. She's the one with the savings account. Meanwhile, she's sitting there thinking, when exactly did I sign up to be the group's financial shock absorber? We'll come back to that, because it gets even more layered. If you're enjoying this kind of breakdown, the psychology behind money, status, and the quiet expectations placed on women who succeed financially, go ahead and subscribe. This channel digs into the financial patterns nobody names out loud, and you don't want to miss where this one goes next. So, let's go back to the coffee shop. Two women, one invoice. What actually happened there isn't really about money at all. It's about a role that got assigned without a vote. One woman became capable, and capability, for women specifically, tends to get mistranslated into obligation almost instantly. Watch how fast it happens. A woman mentions she got a bonus, and within the same conversation, somebody's already mentally spent it for her. Not maliciously, almost affectionately. Oh, good. Now you can help with this. It's said with a smile. It still costs her something every single time. Now here's the part that stings a little, so brace yourself because we did promise sarcasm, not sugarcoating. Women are frequently praised for being generous, dependable, the strong one, the one who always shows up financially. But praise is not compensation. You cannot deposit "you're so generous" into a savings account. And yet an entire generation of financially successful women have been trained to accept applause as payment for labor that was never optional to begin with. This is where the tax compounds. Because it's not a one-time withdrawal. It's recurring. Every month, every favor, every "just this once" that becomes a pattern nobody officially agreed to. And the woman paying it rarely gets to say no without being labeled difficult, cold, or suddenly mysteriously not who we thought she was. Funny how quickly warmth turns into an accusation the second a woman sets a boundary around her own bank account. Let's flip the lens for a second, because here's the part that never gets said in these conversations. This isn't only happening in friend groups or family dynamics. It happens at work too. A woman who manages money well is often handed more responsibility without more authority. She becomes the one who keeps things together on a team, financially and emotionally, while someone else gets the title that comes with the actual power. Competence for women tends to get rewarded with more expectation instead of more leverage. That's the tax showing up in a blazer instead of a coffee shop. So by now you might be thinking, okay, this sounds bleak. Is there a version of this where women actually win? Yes. But not the version social media sells you. Here's the mid-video twist, because we did promise you one. The women who eventually stop paying this tax aren't the ones who earn more. They're the ones who stop translating their money into other people's comfort. That's the actual shift. Not a bigger income. A boundary. Because more money without a boundary just means a bigger invoice slides across the table next time. And this is the part that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. The discomfort of saying no to a financial request doesn't come from the request itself. It comes from a woman's fear of being seen as unkind for the first time in her life. Somewhere along the way, a lot of women were taught that being liked and being financially generous were the same skill. They're not. One is a personality trait. The other is a bank transaction. Confusing the two is exactly how the hidden tax keeps getting collected decade after decade. Let's talk about where this pattern actually starts, because it doesn't start in adulthood. It starts way earlier, back when girls are first taught that being agreeable is safer than being direct. Add money to that equation later in life, and you get a woman who has every financial skill in the world except the one skill nobody ever modeled for her, which is simply saying, "That's not something I'm doing," without an apology attached to the end of the sentence. This is why financially successful women often describe a strange kind of exhaustion that doesn't show up on a spreadsheet. It's not about how much they have. It's about how much of what they have gets quietly reallocated by other people's assumptions before she even gets a say. Call it decision fatigue, with a $sign on it. Now here's where the stakes really escalate, because this isn't just personal, it's generational. A woman who normalizes paying this invisible tax without question tends to raise daughters who assume the same role is simply part of being a capable woman. It becomes inherited, not through a will, but through pattern. Meanwhile, sons in the same household are rarely handed the same silent invoice. Not because anyone planned it that way, because nobody ever questioned it enough to stop it. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath the coffee shop, underneath the invoice, underneath every "you don't mind, right?" A woman's money was never just currency. It became currency plus character test. Pay it and you're generous. Question it, and suddenly you're difficult. There is no version of that setup that was ever fair, and the sooner that gets said plainly, the sooner it stops sounding normal. So where does this actually go from here? Because the goal is never just to describe the problem and leave you sitting in it. The women who eventually break this pattern don't do it with a bigger bank account. They do it with a smaller list of people they feel financially responsible for by default. That's the real wealth move nobody talks about on finance content. Not another investment account. A shorter list of silent obligations. Because financial freedom was never just about having money. It's about who gets to decide where that money goes and whether that decision is actually hers, or whether it was quietly outsourced to everyone around her the moment she became capable enough to be useful. And here's the deeper thing sitting underneath all of it, the thing worth sitting with long after this video ends. Money was supposed to buy women options. Somewhere along the way it started buying other people's comfort instead, at her expense, with her name quietly attached to the receipt. The hidden tax was never really about dollars. It was about whether a woman's success gets to belong to her or whether it automatically becomes shared property the second anyone else notices it exists. That's the real invoice underneath the invoice. And the only person who can ever decide not to pay it is her. Let's go back to that coffee shop one more time because there's a detail worth noticing that we skipped past the first time. Nobody in that scene actually did anything dramatic. No one shouted. No one demanded. The invoice just appeared, the way these things always appear, wrapped in casual language and a totally normal tone of voice. That's actually the most important detail in this entire story. The hidden tax is rarely collected through confrontation. It's collected through comfort. Through the assumption that things will simply continue the way they've always continued because nobody has ever had a reason to think otherwise. And that's exactly why it's so hard to point to. You can't build a protest around a vibe. You can't file a complaint against an assumption. There's no line item on a bank statement that reads emotional labor surcharge because everyone thinks you've got it handled. It just quietly leaves the account, disguised as kindness, disguised as closeness, disguised as being a good daughter, a good friend, a good partner, a good whatever role happens to be convenient that week. Now let's talk about the part almost nobody wants to admit because it's a little uncomfortable and a little too honest. Some of this tax gets collected because women let it, not out of weakness, out of training. There's a very specific kind of praise reserved for women who quietly cover the gap, who quietly smooth things over, who quietly make sure nobody else has to feel the discomfort of a shortfall. That praise feels good. It feels like belonging. And belonging is one of the most expensive things a person can chase because it rarely asks for cash up front. It asks for a pattern, repeated so many times that eventually it just becomes personality. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If a woman stopped paying that invisible invoice tomorrow, would the people around her still see her the same way? Would she still be the reliable one, the strong one, the one who always shows up? Or would that label disappear the second the money stopped moving in her direction? That question alone tends to reveal exactly how much of that identity was ever really about her, and how much of it was about what she provided. This is where the escalation really kicks in, because once you notice this pattern in one part of a woman's life, you start noticing it everywhere. It's not just the coffee shop invoice. It's the group chat where she's tagged first whenever a collection needs organizing. It's the friend circle where she's the unofficial treasurer nobody voted her into. It's the workplace where she's the one who gets asked to mentor for free while someone else gets paid to manage. Different rooms, same pattern, same quiet assumption that her competence is a shared resource rather than her own asset. And here's the part that really deserves a pause. This pattern doesn't get easier the more successful a woman becomes. It gets heavier. Because success, for a lot of women, doesn't buy distance from these expectations. It buys proximity to more of them. The better she does, the longer that mental list of people who assume she's got it grows, quietly, without her ever agreeing to add a single name to it. So here's the real psychological cost sitting underneath all of this, the one that never shows up in a budget breakdown. It's not overspending. It's overgiving without ever being formally asked. And overgiving, when it's expected rather than chosen, doesn't feel generous from the inside. It feels like a low hum of resentment that a woman isn't even allowed to name, because naming it makes her sound ungrateful for a success she worked incredibly hard for in the first place. Let's bring in the deeper insight now, the one this whole video has been circling. Financial freedom for a woman was never just about the number in an account. It's about whether that number still belongs to her once other people find out it exists. Because the second it becomes visible, it stops being purely personal. It becomes communal property, with her name still attached to the paperwork. This is the actual reason so many financially successful women describe feeling strangely unfree even after hitting the goals they worked toward for years. The freedom they pictured was supposed to feel light. Instead, it often feels like managing everyone else's expectations of what her money should be doing for them. That's not freedom. That's a second job with no title and definitely no pay. Here's the shift that actually changes this, and it's smaller than people expect. It's not a bigger income. It's not a better investment strategy. It's a woman deciding, quietly and without a big speech, that her financial capability is not an open invitation. That being able to help does not mean being required to help. That distinction alone is worth more than another zero on a paycheck, because without it, every raise just becomes a bigger target instead of a bigger cushion. And here's something worth remembering the next time an invoice, literal or emotional, slides across a table in her direction. Being asked is a request. Being assumed upon is a tax. One of those deserves a real answer. The other one has been getting a free pass for far too long, simply because nobody stopped to call it what it actually is. So the next time someone says a woman with money is lucky, remember the coffee shop. Remember the invoice. Remember that having money and having control over that money were never actually the same thing for a lot of women, and the real work isn't earning more. It's finally deciding who that money answers to. Her, or everyone standing around waiting to see what she'll cover next. There's one more layer worth pulling apart before we close this out, because it explains why this tax survives even in women who consider themselves financially savvy, boundaried, and completely aware of what's happening around them. It survives because it doesn't ask for a lot at once. That's the trick. Nobody hands a woman a 5-figure invoice out of nowhere on day one. It starts small. It starts with a coffee, a ride, a "can you spot me until Friday" that quietly never gets paid back. Small enough that saying something feels petty. Small enough that the cost of speaking up seems higher than the cost of just paying it. And that's exactly how a pattern becomes permanent. Not through one big moment, through 1,000 small ones that were each too minor to fight over. This is worth naming plainly because it changes how the whole thing should be measured. The hidden tax was never really about the size of any single request. It was about the accumulation. Add up every quiet cover, every unspoken expectation, every moment she paid so nobody else had to feel uncomfortable, and what you get is a number far larger than anything that ever showed up on one receipt. That's the part that stays invisible for years, because nobody sits down and adds up an entire decade of small favors in one sitting. Until eventually something does. And that's usually the moment a woman starts asking the question this whole video has been circling around. Whose money is this actually? Here's the final piece of the puzzle, and it's simpler than anything that came before it. Financial success was always going to change a woman's life. That part was never in question. The real question was always whose terms that change would happen on. Because money without ownership over how it gets used isn't freedom, no matter how large the number gets. It's just a bigger, better funded version of the exact same arrangement she started with. And the women who finally break that pattern aren't the ones with the most money. They're the ones who finally understand that competence was never supposed to be an invitation, and capability was never supposed to be collected on. That's the real story behind every invoice that ever slid across a table toward the woman everyone assumed would pay it. Not weakness. Not generosity gone wrong. Just an old, quiet assumption finally getting called out loud for exactly what it always was.